Hello everyone, I'm Sue Levitt.
And I'm Nancy Byrne as we continue to socially distance ourselves. Thank you for joining us as we kick off what we know will be another very successful journey into the history of Las Vegas.
This is the second in a series of documentaries coming our way, courtesy of the Commission of the Las Vegas Centennial. Now that group funds historic preservations projects of all types through the sale of Las Vegas Centennial license plates. If you have one of those plates, you're helping save the city's history in some way.
And thank you for that. The first program we brought you last year took us back to the birth of our city, covering the years prior to 1905 through 1920. This one picks up where Las Vegas, the early years, left off.
Las Vegas, the 1920s, covers a decade of great transition and growth in technology in our city. We'll be speaking with several key people who really know their Las Vegas history during this program.
That's right, Sue, but who better to kick off our preview than one of the historians featured in the show, Bob Stoddall. While our city was still very young in the 20s, we were already proving to be a city made up of rugged and determined residents who were not going to let a little desert heat and wilderness slow them down. It may have seemed to be just a watering hole train stop in the middle of nowhere to others, but Bob Stoddall says to those early settlers, the 1920s were a decade of hope. Bob, thank you so much for joining us for this preview of this next installment of the documentary. The first one went over really big.
Well, I think this one is going to add to that, and as we move forward, the next one we're looking at is the 1930s, which a tease for that is that's an exciting time of building the dam, legalizing gambling, and really the beginning of the tourist industry. But that's tomorrow.
Okay.
Today is 1920.
And you consider the 1920s to be really a transitional period for the city of Las Vegas.
Well, it's a skipped generation. It's a skipped decade. Most historians and documentary makers, they built the railroad, they built the dam, legalized gambling, and Bugsy Siegel invented Las Vegas, which we all know is untrue. But the 1920s was a tremendous period of transition, not only for Las Vegas, but reflected for the United States and the world in many ways.
And you are famous for trying to constantly dispel the myth that we were wild, wild west crazy people, you know, shooting each other in bars. You really feel like...
Well, some of that was true.
Some of that was true. We've seen pictures of donkeys bellying up to the bar, but you really feel like the railroad, aside from the springs, launched us.
Well, the issue is part of it, it's an image that we have created. We created that in the 1930s with tourism. We couldn't go around the United States and sell legalized gambling. So the way that we snuck that in was we're still a frontier town. We're the last frontier. And with that came El Dorado. And so then that myth developed in the late 1930s. But we were a railroad town. We were built by the railroad. The town was laid out by the railroad. This is where the school is going to be. This is where the courthouse is going to be. This is where you can sell alcohol. The earliest zoning rules were created by the railroad. So it was that. Then the second part would be the fact that it was the primary employer. You had a community in the 20s, roughly 2,500 people. 300 or 400 of those people worked for the railroad. So it was the primary source of revenue within the community for the pharmacies and for the merchants and the businesses in town. It was a railroad town. Now that went through the 1940s when airmail started. Airmail started coming in 1926, which was one of the things that you mentioned, the transition elements. But the aviation industry really developed in Las Vegas in the 1940s. But that, again, we're hopping to another documentary.
You're just teasing the upcoming documentaries. But we think that technology is moving at lightning speed now, as it is. But in the 20s, talk to us about some of the new technology that we were discovering here.
1920 Las Vegas began that decade isolated in the sense that the railroad was the primary source of the connection with the outside world. The newspapers came in, the U.S. mail came in from the railroad, and there was also, if you wanted to get a message outside relatively quickly, you had to send a telegram, a telegraph, and that all changed in the 20s. What changed in the mid-20s was something called radio. We were able to go down to the Majestic Theater, which is now the Golden Nugget, and we would all sit, 200 or 300 of us sit there and listen to the radio phone and hear live broadcasts. It was almost magic in how exciting it was. Then we also had the delivery of airmail. So a friend of yours could, if she handled it right, put a letter in the mail at the post office in the morning, and potentially special delivery could get to you in the afternoon. That was amazing. So now how it got to you in the afternoon? Also, maybe not a technological breakthrough, but home delivery of mail occurred. You didn't have to go down to the post office where the mob museum is, or actually there wasn't, that building wasn't there until 1933. So the post office was located on the corner in the 20s where the Golden Nugget is. So you had the post office on the corner, and next to it the Majestic Theater.
Right. Okay. So you could go get your mail and then go listen to some event at the Majestic Theater.
Right. But in the mid-20s, we started delivering mail to your home.
Perfect.
So that was exciting.
And phone calls, long distance phone calls.
You could send a telegram, but that was about it. The mid-20s, all of a sudden, we had long-distance phone calls. The first one was to San Francisco. And it would just open the town, and these kinds of things were taking place every other week, every other month. There'd be some new technological advancement. Ending in the late 20s was something called talkies.
Right.
You know, the movies were all silent, other than the piano player there, or a violinist or a banjo player. But we got talkies in 1929. So all that's going on, and it's an exciting time.
Yes. Now, also, you had mentioned in your tease for the next one, it was called the Boulder Dam back there. You considered the 20s, especially moving into the later 20s, a decade of hope because we were anticipating that sort of thing?
An idea to build some sort of a dam, some sort of a project to control the Colorado River had been around since the late 1800s. The Colorado River was kind of wild and crazy river. It would flood further down into California. But in the early 1920s, there was a real effort, and the reality that a dam could be built was there, and the people in Las Vegas got excited. And they got excited for a decade. Congress would say yes, and then they would say no, and it would just be an up and down period. During that period of time, 1924-25, people started buying land in Las Vegas. William Farron, who ran the pharmacy, Dr. Martin, who was a lead doctor in town, they bought land from Helen Stewart just north of Washington. And they started selling lots there. And they called their little new community West Side. And so that name has now stuck for almost 100 years. But it started in 1924-25. And they sold almost all the lots.
Right. And if you want to see Helen Stewart, there's a statue of her over at the old Mormon Fort. Isn't that where her statue is?
And it's actually one on the second floor of City
That's
Hall.
A smaller one, but yes, exactly. So I don't want to give away the whole documentary, but I would be remiss if I didn't ask about Prohibition and how that kind of played out in Las Vegas.
Well, Prohibition, like lots of decisions, have unintended consequences. So Prohibition, the community, the city of Las Vegas in 1918, it was on the ballot statewide whether or not we wanted to unilaterally ban the sale of alcohol in the state of Nevada. And we did. We voted that well in advance of the federal government. Well, by 1920, 21, 22, 23, 24, something is happening. The city government is realizing that those quarterly liquor licenses of the 10 to 12 saloons in town were funding government. By the mid-20s, Las Vegas city government is broke. It's in the red. Fire department, the police department, the streets are no longer being taken care of. And so at that point, Las Vegas became involved in what we can say is the first organized crime. And organized crime needs three legs. One, it needs a criminal act, it needs a criminal and it needs some sort of an organization, and that generally involves the government. And so what was arrived at, a decision was that they would bust the bootleggers on a regular basis. They would fine them, and then that money would go into the city coffers. And that was the new mayor that was elected, Fred Hess. Unfortunately, he cut a deal with the city's first gangster, James Ferguson, real bad guy. Ferguson cut his own deal, and that deal was if you were a bootlegger, you had to pay him a fee, protection. Otherwise, he would give your name to the police chief and the mayor, and you would get busted more often. The mayor got indicted by a federal grand jury. The police chief got indicted by a federal grand jury. Ferguson got busted. Ferguson went to prison. Federal judge in Carson City said there really wasn't enough evidence for the mayor and the police chief. And the mayor there was a recall effort, but didn't pan out. He was reelected. But interesting, the streets were all paved. The police department's budget was balanced, and there was no accusation that the mayor or anybody was putting money in their own pocket.
They were putting it toward the city.
We were putting it toward, so it was just this sort of deal. And there was no allegations at all that there was any effort to buy, because they reelected him.
Okay. All right. Well, we're going to have you back when we talk about the 1930s, which you have already teased. But I just want to thank you so much. You're just always such a rich for all of our history, and it's important. So thank you for being here.
I have to say, hats off to the city of Las Vegas. The investment in preserving the history of our community through this process of documentaries and making it available to everybody through Channel 2 and putting it on the web. That's really something that other cities and communities and counties should echo.
Well, they don't all have a Bob Stoddall, but thank you, Bob, for being with us. Sue, you know Bob Stoddall. He is such a rich resource when it comes to learning about the roots of our city. I found it interesting that while we feel like we can hardly keep up with technology today, so much of it was evolving back in the 20s right here in Las Vegas, from mail delivery to telephones. Things we take for granted today took shape here 100 years ago.
So much took place back in that decade, not only technologically, but socially. Over the course of the 20th century, economic opportunities encouraged many African Americans to migrate to the Las Vegas area. But because of racial discrimination, many blacks were denied decent employment. The black community really fused together during some very frightening times when groups like the Ku Klux Klan marched on Fremont Street. I had the pleasure of sitting down with Clay T. White, the director of the Oral History Research Center at UNLV. She walks us through what life was like back in the 1920s for the black community here in Las Vegas. Clay T., thanks so much for taking the time to talk with us about our city's history. We appreciate it.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
You have done so much to preserve our African American history in Las Vegas. And the documentary we're about to watch is, of course, on the 1920s, and there were so many significant events that affect our African American community during that time. And I thought you could just sort of walk us through, starting from the early 1920s, some of those most significant events.
The 1920s was really a very, very important decade for the African American community. In 1924, we have that railroad strike. And so African Americans who've come here in 1905 to work on the railroad along with everyone else. So now they are out of jobs. But at that point, it's still a vibrant community. African Americans live downtown in the same area as everyone else. And it's vibrant.
And it seems like people were peaceful at the time. People lived together and there weren't many issues. Is that right?
Well, everybody lived in the downtown area, which was a small area. But as you know, across the country, there was still segregation. Segregation was not as harsh as it became later on in the early 1930s. But after the railroad strike, we now get another of something else that happens that was not pleasant, and that we see a resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan. And that resurgence is seen all across the country, not just in Las Vegas. 1924, 1925, there is a parade of the Ku Klux Klan down Fremont Street, and they're in full regalia. So of course that's frightening to a small black community. But after a couple of years, the African American community got together and started a branch of the NAACP. That was 1928, branch 1111.
Wow.
It's still the branch number today.
Would you say that the NAACP was formed in part because of maybe the rise in conflict and everything that was going on at the time with the KKK? Would you say that was part of the reason that maybe this organization was founded?
Out of the 5 people who got together to form this chapter of the NAACP, 2 of the 5 were female. So that always,
I love that fact.
Yes,
I love
so that always encourages me. So they started it in 1928. So in 1929, we get notification that there is going to be a dam that's going to be constructed here. So right away, people began to move into this area in greater numbers. So whenever you have greater numbers and you have greater numbers of people coming out of the South, blacks and whites coming out of the South, people bring some of those prejudices with them.
With the end of the 1920s, the dam construction is beginning on the dam. There's now all these jobs.
Early 1931 is when the jobs actually start. But people began to move in. It's the Great Depression, 1929. And so 1929, as the Great Depression begins to percolate across the country, the African Americans are going to move to another community. So they want African Americans to move across the tracks toward the west.
They've built their lives in this area, and now they're being told, you need to move. What was that like?
Well, we really don't know a lot of information about that period. We just know that it happened, and we know that it was not a happy period of time. So there begins to be a little agitation about where they're going to move and how that move takes place.
And what's interesting is, like you said, the historic West Side, still to this day, it's prominently African American that live in that, that area of our city.
But it worked out. African Americans moved to that area of the city, and for years that was the only area where African Americans could live.
And this all began in the 1920s.
All began in 1920s.
Well, Clay T, I wish we could talk to you longer because you are just a wealth of knowledge, and we appreciate you so much. And hopefully when, we do another documentary, we can talk more about getting into the 30s.
That's right.
Because you just have so much great information for us. But we want to thank you for being with us.
Well, thank you for having me.
Clay T dedicates most of her time to preserving our rich history. She's not only the director of oral history for UNLV, but also sits on the Las Vegas Historic Preservation Commission. I just wish that I had more time with Clay T so that we could really sit down and talk about the 1930s when the dam was being built and our city was really taking shape then.
I've heard a rumor there could be
Let's
another
hope.
documentary tracing the 1930s. We want to take a moment to thank the Commission for the Las Vegas Centennial and award-winning Boyd Productions for bringing our city's history to life. As we said earlier, our first documentary was tremendously successful, viewed by 1.5 million people on YouTube alone.
Pretty amazing.
Yes.
Knowing and preserving our history is so important. Knowing what people went through to build Las Vegas gives us an appreciation for those resilient pioneers.
We heard a lot of names, familiar names, tossed around during these documentaries, such as Stewart and Clark. Another name likely to be remembered in our city's history, of course, is Goodman. Mayors Oscar and Carolyn Goodman have presided over our city for more than 2 decades. Of course, Mayor Oscar Goodman from 1999 to 2011. Then he was succeeded by his wife, Mayor Carolyn Goodman, in 2011 to present.
Our fellow producer, Melissa Duran, sat down with Mayor Carolyn Goodman to hear her perspective on the importance of knowing and embracing our past.
Thank you, Mayor, so much for joining us. Tell me a little bit about why documentaries like this are so important to Las Vegas.
For all of us who've made Las Vegas home, who hadn't lived here from the beginning, and certainly not in those days, we really had no idea what the history of this community has been, and certainly for us to know what's grown out of it helps you know by looking back.
Absolutely. The first documentary got so much attention.
1 million viewers already.
It's amazing. It was such a well done documentary. This second documentary is anticipating a lot of viewership as well. What do you think it is about Las Vegas that people really just want to learn more about our past, and we hold the attention of people when we talk about our past? Why do you think that is?
You know, I think so many of us grew up and heard about the wild woolly West and the development of Las Vegas when Bugsy Siegel came and gaming started. They really don't know what that was, and there's a beauty in it and a peace and a quiet, and yet an excitement is, wow, maybe this started because of that. Where did the shows come from? Where did these different ideas come from? And so it's important for us in everything always to learn about what's come before we plan for the future.
I know that when our communications team posts on social media old pictures, vintage pictures of old Vegas, it does so well. It seems like there's a spark and people want to know where that energy came from. Do you think that that's also what people just want to know, where our energy comes from?
You know, everybody needs to learn. Every day is a learning experience as you have relationships, but certainly for our children, when you look at future generations, when none of us will be here, for them to look back at today, maybe in 2020, and think, oh my gosh, it's 2080, but look what they were doing then. So we're all part of a continuum, and I think it's fascinating. It's just, I love to see the historical videos that we're showing.
What about the history of the dam? Do you like learning about that part of Las Vegas's?
Oh, I wish we had more time on this piece of the video because I have some stories that are fascinating about that. And of course, wonderful videos out in Boulder City and their museum out there that takes you through that. But even personal relationships of people who I knew, who no longer here, that worked on the dam. And that has been simply an incredible piece of the history that I've learned about, which has been wonderful.
Mayor, you chair the Centennial Commission, so how do you all decide which projects to pursue and why?
Well, you know, very fortunately for me, my husband was chair and the creation of that Centennial Commission. And they had a great group sitting there, including those who made possible how we're funding it through the Centennial license plate. Louise Helton and Bob Coffin both have sat on that commission for, well, he's still back on it again. And they really have set up a procedure for evaluating all the programs, all the monies that come from the Centennial that specifically will be directed towards projects that have a historic value. And it's just been a wonderful process to hear the discussions that go along after we review every application that comes through. And they've been great, but this particular group had evaluated the Boyd Industry selection to go ahead and make the first film up to the 1920s, and of course now Jennifer Boyd, who is that great person behind these films, these historical films, is the one that's gotten the contract to move forward with the 20s to the 30s.
It's amazing to see some of the video that they have and the pictures that they have that I've never seen before, but is out there.
Well, you know, and we've partnered too with the Las Vegas News Bureau. It's part of the Las Vegas Convention and Visitors Authority. They've had these fabulous photographs for years before, and we have such wonderful members on the commission. Bob Stoddall, historian personified, who is exact on every date, and heaven forbid we do it wrong. But everyone, Governor and former U.S. Senator Richard Bryan, we have a wonderful team of people who are very reliable, always make the meetings, and absolutely enjoy the work and learning all the time from what we've missed, what we could add to something.
You touched on it a little bit. How is the commission funded?
Well, when we all go get our annual plates and get that little decal that we put on, there is a choice through the Department of Motor Vehicles to get a specialized plate, one of which is celebrating our centennial. And it has the beautiful Welcome to Las Vegas sign on it, and there's an extra fee beyond the basic cost of a basic plate. And those monies are directed to the centennial to preserve the history of Las Vegas. And so those dollars, and we appreciate everybody who buys a centennial place, because we have so many choices today. As you know, we love our Golden Knights, and we love the Raiders, and our Springs Preserve, the arts, and so many good causes. But this really comes back to the city to be definitively directed to the history preservation.
You're looking forward to the documentary yourself?
I am. I can't wait. And what I love most about it is, I mean, I've watched the first one so many times, and the opportunity through the city of Las Vegas to be able to see it again and again, because you miss something each time you see these documentaries. There's a little nuance that you missed before. So we're really excited about it and proud of how the dollars have been spent, and the work that Jennifer Boyd and her entire company have done.
All right, thank you so much,
Thank you for having me.
You know, speaking of names, Levitt is certainly a name familiar to all Las Vegans. Now, Sue is not one to throw her family's prominence around, not because she's not proud, but because she is humble. But I often try to pry it out of her, which is what I'm going to do for a few moments right now. Sue, tell us a little bit about your family. Your grandfather and your father were really a big part of our history. Let's start with your grandfather.
Well, my grandfather, he was born in 1895, and he was part of some of the first pioneers that settled in Bunkerville, Nevada. And so in the 1920s, he moved to Las Vegas, and he actually worked at City Hall as the street superintendent and was paved the first, Maryland Parkway.
Sure.
And where Maryland Parkway in Charleston is, he was part of that, and he was also a county commissioner. And so he, was here and saw everything that was going on back when the city was just getting started.
Now, your father, of course, came a little bit later, and I think a lot of people today are still very familiar with Myron Levitt.
Yes, he was born in 1935, and he started as a deputy city attorney here for the city. So both of them worked for the city and then became a justice of the peace, city commissioner, county commissioner, district court judge, and then ended his career sitting on the Supreme Court.
Yes.
He was also lieutenant governor of the state, and so during that time, he was never home because, of course, he was traveling to the legislature, and those were sure fun times, though.
Fun times for your mom with 11 kids at home, Sue, the youngest of 11. Thank you so much, Sue, for sharing. I really do try to pry this stuff out of her because she doesn't talk about it much. Again, not because she's not proud, but because she's humble. So anyway, it's through people like you that we can keep all of those memories alive. And we want to thank you for joining us for this preview of Las Vegas, the 1920s. We will be airing this documentary more than once. Please check KCLV.TV for future dates and times. You'll also be able to view it on YouTube. Now, we got a sneak peek of the show, and we really feel like you're going to enjoy it as much as we did.